All right, welcome back to BS Free MD, where we explore topics on faith, family, fun, and of course, medicine, something I think we know something about. I'm Dr. Tim Hindmarsh.
And I am Dr. May Hindmarsh. Today, we have a truly fascinating guest joining us. It is John Burke, who is a New York Times bestselling author, known for his books Imagine Heaven and Imagine the God of Heaven, along with four others. And John has spent over 35 years researching over 1,000 cases. I think it's 1,000 or more of near-death
I think we're up to
experiences.
1,500.
Okay. Near-death experiences that we will refer to as NDEs and their correlation to the Bible. And, we actually have listened to his interview on a podcast. Well, I'll just say the Sean Ryan podcast was totally fascinating. And so today we're going to get into asking him some questions about his newest book, Imagine the God of Heaven, talking about NDEs of all backgrounds and continents encountering the same God as described in the Bible and how they correlate to the story of God as woven through the scripture. So I can't wait to get into that. And also have to throw in that he and his wife, Kathy, founded the multi-site Gateway Church in Austin, Texas, which he led for 26 years. And now they're focusing on their writing outreach ministry. And John is also a proud papa to a grown son and daughter and son-in-law and a couple of granddaughters, I believe. So it's so exciting to have you on the show. Welcome, John.
Hey.
Thanks for being here. We are so honored to have you. This is
Oh,
great.
I'm honored to be here.
Awesome.
Yes, you're right. Those two little granddaughters, man, they got my heart.
We're waiting. I would have like a 12-year-old.
Well, let me tell you, it's the reason you had kids.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think I'm almost. I'll be 59 in actually 3 weeks, and my mother was 48 when she was a grandmother, and I'm like, holy cow!
Oh,
I
wow.
know.
Still
It
waiting.
motivates you to stay because, man, they keep you busy.
Oh, I bet.
Well, there you go. That's why you're running on that elliptical every day.
Yeah, that's exactly right. All right, so let's get into this. I love kind of how you came into the faith. This whole business of NDEs, kind of to some people sounds kind of woo woo and out there and so forth.
Did to me.
So let's just start at the beginning. Your journey to faith started actually by exploring NDEs. Is that correct?
Yeah. I was an agnostic. I studied engineering and I worked as an engineer. So I've always had a very analytical mind. I want to know how the puzzle pieces fit together, right? And, solving problems and putting data together. And that's just kind of the way I'm wired. I always have been. So, I grew up around Christian faith and I had a lot of questions. Like, how do you know there's a God? And, Jesus, I mean, yeah, he's probably a great man, but legend, it happens. And, I knew enough to know these things. And so I had a lot of questions, and it didn't seem like many people who believed either wanted to talk about it or had answers to it. And I just decided the whole thing was just a kind of a social game. And I was like, I'm done. So yeah, I kind of went my own way. My dad was dying of cancer, and someone gave him the very first research that coined the term near-death experience. And I saw it on his bedside table and picked it up and started thumbing through it. And I was just fascinated. So I read the whole book in one night. And at the end of reading that, I said, oh my gosh, this could be the evidence I've been looking for, because so many of them talked about, the soul living on and afterlife, this God of light and love. And many of them talked about encountering Jesus. And even though I didn't believe in any of it, it's like they chronicled at that point, that was Dr. Moody. And, he had about 100 cases that he put in that first book, that first research. And that was enough to get my attention, right? So it didn't lead me to faith, but it opened me to considering it. And so then I started reading the Bible. I started studying more near-death experiences, and eventually I researched other world religions, and I did ultimately come to faith in Jesus, and actually not because of near-death experiences at all. One of the reasons I'm really excited about this new book, Imagine the God of Heaven, is I put some of the historical evidence in there as well as the near-death experience evidence. And it was really the historical evidence that ultimately convinced me, because I didn't have that many data points of near-death experiences at that time. But because I'm just curious, I just kept researching, and I ended up, my wife and I lived in Santa Barbara, California for 7 years in the 80s and early 90s. And that turned out to be the kind of the locus of where near-death experience research was taking place.
Hmm.
So I would come upon them, hear about them, and I just started to notice patterns of similarities, and I charted it. So that's the way my mind works.
Of course.
Spreadsheets and stuff like that. So, and now it's been, well over 35 years of moving from a career in engineering to becoming a pastor. My wife and I started Gateway Church 26 years ago for skeptics like me. So we started a church because, when I finally had a place where I could ask my questions and wrestle, and I wasn't afraid of offending people, I found really good answers. And so we started Gateway Church for that purpose. And turns out there are thousands of people like me.
Yes.
And which was really, it was really both fun and encouraging to see so many people, once they really did explore, find faith.
Wow. So was your wife a non-believer as well, or did she
No,
grow up?
she grew up in the church.
Mm-hmm.
And she was always a strong believer. And we met.
I wasn't sure if she was like getting into the whole NDEs just like you at the same time, or if she had a different path. Interesting.
No, and I think initially, the reason it took me 35 years of research to write the book is I thought they were kind of weird too. I did, and there were some things that they would say, and I'm like, okay, well, how does that fit? And and as I learned more and more about the scriptures and about God's revelation through history, then I also wanted to know, okay, well, how do these one-offs fit that? And so it took me a while to find what I call the interpretive keys that really kind of help the puzzle pieces fit together. And so I didn't write on it. I spoke on, I actually spoke on near-death experiences and the Bible in 1989 at the University of California, Santa Barbara. So I still have that talk.
Wow.
And I just, it was the beginning of, elementary putting it together and just showing people who are interested in it. So I've talked on it, but I didn't write about it until 2015 with Imagine Heaven.
And so I think people, myself and listeners will probably be fascinated by the fact that you didn't have a near-death experience, correct? I mean, it's just becoming fascinated. The book that was at your father's bedside, and then researching it, and because we've already released our other interview with Eben Alexander about his experience being mostly an agnostic, and then having his experience and what that was like. So yours is totally different. It's just being fascinated by the whole thing, and look where it's led you. Wow. Okay.
Yeah, I don't, what was intriguing about them to me is really more the analytical evidence that I see. Now, on the other side of it, I realize it is greatly colored in the picture I got from scripture. So I think it hadn't just affected my head, it's affected my heart as well, and understanding just how wonderful God is, and how amazing the life to come is going to be. And that's part of what I was writing for. I wrote both Imagine Heaven and Imagine the God of Heaven, really for skeptics to see the evidence, but then also for believers to see, man, first of all, there's nothing to fear in death. It's a step into a continuation of this life, but in dimensions and experiences so much greater. And the God of Scripture is so much more wonderful than even Christians believe. And I'm also trying to show, especially in the new book, that this is the God of all nations. He doesn't favor some people over others. He's not, some people say, okay, so you're just trying to prove that your religion's the right religion. No, that's not it at all. It's actually kind of the opposite. It's showing that the God who revealed himself through history has always been the God of all nations. And that's what he's proving today, even in, I've interviewed people on every continent and every religious background. And the God they're describing is the God who revealed himself throughout history. But that doesn't mean he, favors one group of people over another. He doesn't.
I thought he was a Republican from Texas.
Oh, stop.
Well, you sometimes get that impression listening, don't you?
Yeah, you sure do. So
I want to get into
we got to
some
get
of the
into
meat
these
of it.
into
So,
these stories.
We've heard like a lot of them listening to the interview before, but yeah, can you share some of those interviews, experiences, how they correlate to the biblical description of God and what they have in common? Because I'm thinking, or maybe people listening thinking, well, if you're Hindu, or are you talking about people from around the world that are Christians, or are you talking about different faiths like Hindus or people that believe
Yeah.
that whether you're a Buddhist or you're
So and I think that's another incredible piece of evidence, right? Is people experiencing a God. And so I have studied, probably close to 1,500 near-death experiences. But what people don't realize is these are way more common than has typically been reported. Now, the Gallup poll, they did a poll in, I think it was the 90s, early 90s, that found 1 out of 25 Americans claimed to have had a near-death experience, which is millions. This is like 13 million Americans. But 2019, the European Academy of Neurology reported a study across 35 countries and found they claim that 10% of people said they've had a near-death experience. Now, I actually look closely at that data. I think it carves back to the about 5%, or 1 out of 20, closer to the Gallup poll, because they included people in their study who had drug-induced experiences that they weren't at the point of clinical death, but they felt like they were dying maybe. And so I try to focus in on those who there's some evidence that they actually clinically died. To me, that's more verified. That's more like, okay, something happened to you. You're not just saying, well, I had this experience, because I don't know how to validate that.
Well, right, because there's a lot of people, whether you're getting a ketamine infusion for your psychotherapy or on a LSD trip versus having
DMT,
you're not
a lot of people say
yeah.
A lot of people say that to me. In fact, in chapter 2 of Imagine the God of Heaven, I take a look at these alternate explanations to near-death experiences. Like, the simplest explanation is what every near-death experiencer says. I left my body. I was self, I have a soul, and my consciousness continued on. That's the simplest explanation. And if you look at Occam's razor, it's a scientific principle that, given all this data and a lot of different possible explanations, go with the simplest. But there've been a lot of alternate explanations, like, well, DMT produces experiences like that, or ayahuasca, or anoxia, lack of oxygen in the brain, or isn't it a cause, your brain as you're dying is getting flooded with endorphins and other chemicals, and none of that makes sense of the evidence. And so even the skeptics, like a Dr. Michael Shermer, who used to say, I was just happening in the brain, realized, okay, that doesn't make sense to the evidence. So he started saying, well, it's something that happens as the brain reboots.
Right.
And
Yes.
the brain is kind of making up this story or taking in all the senses. Well, yeah. So some of the evidence that convinced me, and I go into 10 points of evidence, but I'll just do a couple of them. Veridical observations. So when someone first leaves their body, when they die clinically, they leave their body, but they say they're many times still in the room. So we still have a body. We have a spiritual body, just like Paul talked about in 1 Corinthians 15. And, Paul says our bodies are buried, a natural body, but they're raised a spiritual body. They're buried in weakness, but they're raised in power. Dunamos is the Greek word. And interestingly, near-death experiencers say my body had new powers, like not 5 senses, more like 50 senses. Eyesight that's telescopic. You can see for thousands of miles as if right up close. Communication that's thought to thought, heart to heart, pure. So there are all these things. Well, initially, though, they say they leave their body and they're still often in the room where the resuscitation is taking place. Now, that's key because, like Dr. Michael Sabum was a Christian cardiologist that I interviewed, and he set out to disprove near-death experiences back when I started studying them 35, 40 years ago. And he thought, no, this is bogus. I'm a cardiologist. I've never heard of anything like this. And then he started actually asking his patients. And when he started asking them, not just judging them like, oh, you're whacked. And that's what people typically get. And that's why they shut down, because they say this experience is more real than anything they've ever experienced on earth. So how do you explain that? And the way I explain it is it's as if we are going into expanded dimensions of reality. That's why it feels more real. So kind of like, imagine if this 3-dimensional experience we're having is actually being lived on a flat 2-dimensional black and white painting in your living room. And death means separation. So your soul is peeled off that 2-dimensional world and brought out into this 3-dimensional world of color that was all around you. Your world was contained within it, but you only had up and down and side to side. You didn't even have in or out. That's not a dimension you can even conceive of. And so now you're brought out into this expanded experience of dimensionalities and color. And then imagine getting pressed back into your 2-dimensional world and trying to describe 3 dimensions of color in 2-dimensional black and white terms. And that's what near-death experiencers are trying to do.
Wow.
So,
yeah, I heard you describe, sorry to interrupt, but things like how sounds had like taste. They, that senses had multiple senses to them. Not, people that would tell the story. Yeah, like they could, color had a smell to it, or sounds had a taste and a feeling, and that there was other senses that beyond what we know. And that blew my mind. I'm like, yeah, that kind of makes sense.
But I think that it's like what C.S. Lewis called life, which was the shadowlands. So, we live in the shadows of reality, not in reality itself, because the real reality is the reality of God, which is not this life, it's the next life. And I think you get tastes of it, because like I've always been hung up with this whole concept of time, like when is right now, because it tumbles into the next moment and the next moment and the next moment, and we always kind of live in the future and the past and the present all at the same time. We have to, or else you cannot construct any meaning. I go to work as a physician. I'm taking all of these years of experience and training and reading to the present moment to make a decision, to then write a prescription, which the patient is then going to get in the future. And hopefully the future's better because they're going to get better. So we all kind of have this sense that we live in all of these dimensions of time at once, but we don't.
Well,
we actually just we actually are just in the present all the time. And so in a way you kind of get this sense that there has to be more reality than what we're experiencing now. And we get these little kind of hints once in a while, and then it's back to watch the news.
All of life points that way. It's like a famous Zen parable, you know, that the finger is great for pointing at the moon, but woe to the person who mistakes the finger for the moon.
Mm.
And the point is, you know, that there are things in life that are pointing towards something. C.S. Lewis said this as well,
Yeah.
right? He said, so in this life, there is thirst. And lo and behold, there's drink to satisfy our thirst. There's a longing for food. And yes, there's the ability to satisfy that with food. And we have all these desires that can be satisfied. But he said, if we have a desire that can't be satisfied on earth, then it must mean we were meant for something beyond earth. And of course, our desire to be fully known and fully loved and fully accepted, you know, you can have the best spouse in the world and it's never 100%, right? And fully at peace and fully, you know, all these things, like peace comes, but then it goes. Joy comes, but then it goes. And everything, you know, engineering word, you know, positive entropy. Everything goes toward chaos given enough time, right?
Right.
And
Yeah.
all these things are signs. I believe they're signs from God. And they're pointing towards something that we know intuitively was the way life was meant to be, but it's not.
Right.
But how, you know, this is just, we had this conversation. I think it was last night, and I was freaking out about the whole live your best life. And it drives me crazy because there's something about it that's just so Oprah-fied, it makes me nuts. Because what's your best life? Okay, so is it $10 million? Is it $10 billion? Is it a yacht full of hot women like when Tiger
Yeah.
Woods got in trouble? Like, what is it? And the
Yeah.
answer is, if you rely on yourself to live your best life, you will be miserable, because even when you get to where you think you are, there's still another level to go.
Yeah.
And so and then it just becomes this endless, fruitless, empty journey where when you realize, no, I cannot be completely satisfied here. We live in the Shadowlands, and what we have to look forward to is so much greater. It gives you so much peace and freedom and meaning in this life, because this life is just the next life is just a continuation of what we're already doing now.
Well, let's hear about
Exactly.
some of those.
Yeah.
I think for me, the clincher, I thought you were going to say this, but you didn't, or maybe you're going to get there, is when people leave their body and then they're explaining what they're seeing happen that they would have no knowledge of. The stories of, that one boy that met his
Sister
that it was a miscarriage and the parents never talked about her, or somebody's in, a medical in the ER and they're explaining something that somebody said, or the music playing, or some procedure that happened that no one told them about, or that father that was crying in the closet and the son came back. And so,
No, those
tell us
are-
about those. To me,
Yeah.
that's
Yeah,
the
that is
evidence.
that's where I was going, and I went rabbit.
Yeah, well, that's
him
us.
too.
I'm the king
Squirrel.
of yeah.
No,
I should have been
you
named
know, that's-
Alice.
I get excited about something. I chase a squirrel down there. So the verifiable observations, what Dr. Sabum, who I was saying was a cardiologist who set out to disprove them, when he started asking his patients, he discovered them being able to describe resuscitation that he was doing on a patient. And he said, these people should not have known what I was doing because they had no brain waves. Their heart, what is it, like 5-10 seconds after your heart stops beating, your EEG goes flat? Isn't it something like that?
It's about 8.
Yeah.
Anoxia hits.
Yeah. So
I was going to make a political joke, but I decided to restrain myself as far as how long it takes.
So here, the thing is, first of all, if these are just happening in the brain, the brain makes consciousness, right? That's the materialistic view. Right. The brain is just neural networks. Memories are just stored in neural networks. So if there's no neural activity, where are these memories during this near-death experience being stored? Nobody can answer that. So that's one. Second is, like Dr. Sabum found, he said, I could have taken the tape from these near-death experiencers describing what I did in resuscitation and used it to teach other physicians how to do resuscitation. And so, you know, you have, and I give other examples in the new book. I report on a woman in London. Her name is Mary. She dies giving childbirth. She leaves her body. She also has other, you know, she travels through this tunnel to a place of incredible beauty. She's in the presence of this God of light and love who knows her. She never wants to leave. She feels this incredible compassion and forgiveness for a bunch of stuff that she knew she had done wrong. And he says to her, you need to go back. Your son, Michael, who she was just giving birth to, is going to live, and he's going to need you. So she doesn't want to come back. And this is one of the things I love is how many near-death experiencers argue with God. I mean, like, we're ourselves, right? And they're like, no way. I'm not going back. I know what I'm going back. This is great. I'm not going. But anyway, she does. And as she's coming through the ceiling of the hospital, she sees on the top side of a ceiling fan, and this was in the 90s in London, so they still had ceiling fans in hospitals. She sees a red sticker on the top side, and when she comes back, she tries to explain to all the doctors and nurses this amazing experience. They think she's psychotic, right? And until she tells one nurse exactly what she said, where she walked, what she did, and that got the nurse's attention. And then she said, Mary said, look, I can prove it to you. Go get an orderly and a ladder and look on the top side of the ceiling fan. And she did. And sure enough, there's the red sticker, and it said exactly what Mary said it said on the sticker. Now, that's not a one-off. Dr. Pim van Lommel is a cardiologist in Holland that I've also spoken with and interviewed. And he actually published about a near-death experience that he oversaw in the Lancet, which, as you know, is Europe's most prestigious medical journal. By the way, Dr. Sabum published 5 years of research he did trying to disprove near-death experiences in JAMA, in the Journal of the American Medical Association. And then he wrote a book because he had changed his mind. But in Holland, this man's found in a park. His heart's not beating. They bring him into the hospital. They're going to shock his heart, but they discover they need to intubate him. And the nurse realizes he has dentures, takes the dentures out, puts him in the lower drawer of the crash cart. They intubate him, shock him, get his heart going, but he never came to in the ER. They wheel him out to another room. A week later, he comes out of coma, and he's bothered that they lost his dentures. And then he sees the nurse in the hallway, and he says, get that nurse. That nurse knows where my dentures are. And then he explains that he was present in the ER up above, trying to get their attention, saying everything was fine. And he described the nurses and doctors that were in the room, and that one nurse had taken his dentures and put them in the lower drawer of that cart with all the bottles on it. Oh. And that's where they found his dentures. So you have Dr. Janice Holden, who actually studied 100 cases of near-death experiences with observations that could be verified. And what she found is, so each patient might make 10, 20 observations of what happened during their resuscitation, right? She found that 92% of their observations were completely accurate. And just stop and think about that. They're describing resuscitation and what happened in the room while they had no brain waves. 6% were mostly accurate. Some, differences. Only 2% were inaccurate, and that turned out to be one patient she studied. So that's what got my attention years ago as a skeptical engineer. Is okay, wait a second. These are grounded in our reality. This is not just something happening as a hallucination. And then the other thing that really got my attention is that when people who are blind from birth have a near-death experience, they can see. Yeah. And they see the same things as sighted people.
Bizarre. That's bizarre.
Well, then they start describing
proof right there.
Yeah, they start describing what they see. Yeah. but yet they don't understand what sight is, and so they're trying to like what you talk about, how they try to describe color because they don't know
Well,
what red.
and so it's an adjustment for some of them. For some of them, at first it's scary. Others seem to have a sense, like I know what this is. But yeah, they describe color like different brightnesses. That's how they sometimes describe it. Because again, they don't have words for the different connections of the colors.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah, that is so. The stuff I was especially intrigued is these cross faiths, different faiths. So
Mhm.
people of different faiths have a near-death experience, and they experience the God of the Bible. And because when we talked to Eben Alexander, he's like, well, yeah, people seem to interpret these experiences based on what their culture was. And what you're saying is, from what you've seen, is it's exactly the opposite to that. And so can you give us,
okay. Yeah.
address that, and then you have to get into the story of the Somali gentleman. That is just a mind blower.
Sadiq, the
Yes.
Rwandan imam.
Yeah, Rwandan imam.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll try to tell you a couple of them because they're so, and I've gotten it. These are friends now. I know them all over the world. It's so cool.
Wow.
But so let me say this first. A couple of important things to understand is one, near-death experiences are an experience beyond this life. Like I said, from multiple dimensions beyond. When people come back, they do often interpret what they experienced in their own cultural worldview.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not necessarily what they report. Okay, and I'll explain what I mean. So what people report, and I wrote Eben's story in my first book, Imagine Heaven, because Eben experienced the same God of light and love. This is what he wrote in Proof of Heaven. So I just quoted him in Proof of Heaven. Same God of light and love, who he said is personable, has the qualities that we would sometimes call human, compassion and mercy and love and even humor and irony and things like that. And he writes all these things that perfectly align, and this God of light, brighter than the sun, but not hard to look at. All these same things that people experience all around the globe, but his interpretation of that has shifted since he's come back. So that can happen. That can happen. You can interpret things different ways. But what people are reporting. So in Imagine the God of Heaven, I interviewed 70 people on every continent, except Antarctica. I have to, someone called me on that. Like, even Antarctica, I was like, no,
they're all dead.
No penguin near-death experiences
That's
yet.
because they're all dead.
Yeah, exactly.
Nobody came back from Antarctica.
And every religious background. So for instance, Santosh Akarchi was a manufacturing engineer, Hindu, grew up in India. The Hindu scriptures is all he knew. He codes. So he hears code blue and he leaves his body. He sees his body down below. And he told me, he said, I thought when I die, there would probably be nothing. Or maybe you come back as another life form. He said, but that's not what happened. What happened is this brilliant divine light came. And again, they say brighter than the sun. And I fell in love with this light, he said, because I knew it was for me and there to protect me. And this light takes him and they journey and they come to this place that he's up above, looking out over what he described to me as a giant compound or a complex. Now, I've been to India many times, and there are compounds everywhere. They're high-walled, gated compounds. It's just for protection. So he describes it that way. But what he describes perfectly is what John describes in Revelation 21. It's the holy city of God. Wow. And he said it had very high, gorgeous walls all around it, square shaped. And he told me, your eyesight's telescopic there. So I could see thousands of miles, and I could see inside, and there was this, beautiful gardens and grounds. And he said these buildings, mansions and buildings of otherworldly building material, which is fascinating because he's a manufacturing engineer. So he notices the building materials, right?
I love
Which is cool because we are ourselves on the other side.
Right.
It's interesting. But he describes this place, and he sees people inside, and he said, I desperately wanted to go into this place. He said, this is what every human longs to be, is in this place. And he just intuitively felt that. And he said, so he's looking for a way in. And he said, I counted, there were 12 gates. I could see all the way around, and there were 12 gates. Well, that's exactly what John describes in Revelation 21, a city square shaped, 1,400 miles by 1,400 miles, and these tall walls, 214 feet high and thick, because the angel measured them for John. That's in Revelation 21. And these gates guarded by angels. And that's what Santosh said. He said, when I saw the angels outside the gate nearest to me, I realized I'm looking at the kingdom of heaven. Now, Santosh goes on to have a vision of this place that is an abyss of darkness with a lake of fire, he said. So hell, he sees that. And he doesn't want to go there. He wants to go into this city, but he can't figure out how to get in. And then he turns and he sees who he says is the Almighty, but in the form of what looks like a human on a throne, but giant. And he looks into his eyes, and they were like eyes of lightning, he said. And boom, he has a life review, and he sees all his sins, and he falls on his face and starts saying, Lord, please forgive me. He said, this was Almighty God. I didn't have to ask. There was no question about it. I knew who this was. And he started saying, forgive me, forgive me, forgive me. And he thought God was going to send him to hell. But instead, when he spoke to him, he said, Santosh, I'm sending you back to the earth. And when you go back, you must love your family and love your daughter, especially. She needs your help right now. And he said, when I heard the mercy and the love and the compassion and tenderness in the Lord's voice, then he started to kind of breathe a sigh of relief. And so anyway, he starts to have this amazing conversation with God. And he sees, it's like God was telling him a parable, because he sees what he called a very narrow gate to the right side of this throne where the Lord was, and it was open to him to go into this city of God. And he asked the Lord, he said, Lord, when I come back, how do I go through that narrow gate? And so the Lord doesn't tell him, but what he does tell him is he says, because Santosh was thinking about religion. What religion do I do? And he said, no, I want relationship. Not one day a week, but 365 days. I want to see how honest, how real, how sincere you are with me. And he said, walk with me. And Santosh comes back to earth, and he's confused. He's like, this was not the God of the Hindu scriptures. Who was this God of light and love, and appears in the form of this man the second time? And anyway, he's praying every day, seeking who is this God. And 2 years later, his daughter gets invited to sing in a choir in a church, because she was a choral major. Santosh goes to hear her, walks into the church, feels the same loving presence of that God of light. And the message that day was on Matthew 7, the narrow gate, the narrow way that leads to life, and John 10, where Jesus says, I am the gate for the sheep. Whoever enters through me will enter into eternal life. And Santosh was like, oh my gosh, this was like just for me. Goes home, starts reading the Bible, and he said, everything I experienced was in that book. So he comes to faith in Jesus. And by the way, Santosh passed away. He went through those gates into that city just 6 weeks ago. Sweet man.
You're going to make it hard for us to ask questions because we're
I
good at
know.
falling. So we're both quite sensitive. So I'm as much as I try to pretend like I'm tough, I'm not.
Is there a theme? I think I've heard you say this, but does there seem to be like a lesson that these people with near-death experiences have? I mean, some of them, it's just like they see what's happening during their resuscitation and they come back in their body, and it's, you know, it's like my dentures are in the bottom drawer. The theme was I was out of my body to find my dentures. No,
Right,
but
right.
when like people like him, is there like a lesson that it seems like they're trying to learn? Maybe not. Maybe it varies just depending on the individual, especially when they're in the heavenly realm. I want to get to the opposite realm here in a little bit, but does it seem like it's people who, because I've heard you talk about, you know, someone that was like a drug abuser, who didn't he believe in God or something? I'm trying to remember how it went, and he was abusing drugs, believed in God, but the lesson was basically getting clean. I could be totally messing it up, but
Are you thinking of Paul Ojeda?
Yeah, I think so.
Who died of a cocaine overdose?
Yeah.
Yeah. I was with Paul yesterday. Yeah. So he dies of a cocaine overdose, and he is dropping in an outer darkness.
Yeah.
And he was thinking, he knew he was going to hell. He knew it. And he said, I shouldn't be going here. I'm a good person. Like I share cocaine with people. I tell them if they're about to get busted, and I've never murdered anybody. I've never stolen from anybody. And he said, the more I was trying to justify my righteousness, the faster I was falling. And then he finally comes to the end of himself and he just says, God, if you are real, I need you now. I need your help now. And he says, whoosh. He didn't stop falling, but there's this presence right beside him. And he knew who it was. He didn't have to ask. And he knew this was God. And he hears a voice in his soul, Paul, what have you done with the life I've given you? And then boom, he said, as big as the sky, my whole life, every scene relived. And again, that's a commonality, you know, is that near-death experiencers say time doesn't work the same way on the other side. You know, some have told me, well, there is no time, but others say, no, there is time, but there's all the time in the world. And I talk in Imagine Heaven about how two-dimensional time would have that sense. And you know, the scripture says this, Peter in 2 Peter 3:8 says, to the Lord, a day is like 1,000 years and 1,000 years is like a day. And they say, Eben in his first book said almost the same thing. Like I didn't know if it was a second or years, you know, and years felt like a second, you know, it's a similar thing. But I was going to say one other thing that, you know, back to Swadik is I interviewed Bibi in Tehran, who experiences this same, and Santosh said this almighty God who appeared in the form of a man, he later realized that Jesus is the form of God, the face of God that we can understand. And that same exact form appears to Bibi in Tehran, when she has a heart attack, and he says to her, he comes, she's expecting to be judged. He comes and he says to her, I am he who is. And boom, she's back in her body with this peace like she's never felt before. And, you know, this is being translated to me from Farsi into English. But this is the same God who appears to Moses in this burning light, this bush that wouldn't burn, this brilliant light on Mount Sinai. And he says, I am he who is, right? But I am the self-existent one. And so you see that Swadik was this Muslim imam in Rwanda, who I also interviewed. His father was a Hutu. His mother was a Tutsi during the genocide, blew their family apart. 8 years old. He's living on the streets, doing drugs and dealing drugs just to survive. But later he reconciles with his father and he becomes a Muslim imam, mainly to try to, get in good with his father. And then he gets blood cancer as a young man in his 20s. And he's dying of blood cancer. And his father brings the Muslims to try to put the Quran on his head and heal him that way. And his mom was a follower of Beko, this goddess of the African religion they followed. Tried all that tribal, stuff, didn't help. And finally, when he's about to die, in desperation, his mom went to the Anglican church in their town, because she had heard sometimes Jesus heals people. And she asked them, and they fasted and prayed for 7 days. And she was praying to Jesus as well, just in desperation. Swidik dies. And he said he found himself in this dark room that he described as like a slaughterhouse. That's the way he described it. And into this came these 3 creatures. I mean, it sounded like demonic-like creatures that began to just torture him, when suddenly into the room steps a man of light in a robe, but light is just shooting out of him. And again, he said, this light comes into me, like into my eyes, into my soul, and just pierced right through me, saw everything in me. And this man holds out his hands, and Swidik said he had wounds in his wrist right here. And that's how he knew who he was, because Swidik had seen the Passion of the Christ when it had come to Rwanda. And so this man of light never says, I'm God. He never says, I'm Jesus. He says, I died for mankind. You are among those I died for. Never deny it and tell it to everyone. And boom, Swidik sits up. Now, he had died that evening. He sits up and a sheet falls off of him, and he looks, and all these Muslims start running and screaming, and he looks down to his right, and there's a grave. And he doesn't realize he's at his own burial. And today, Swidik is an Anglican priest in Rwanda, and he's had 7 attempts on his life, including his father tried to kill him, because he won't shut up about Jesus, because Jesus rescued him.
Wow.
So 70 people like this that I chronicle throughout Imagine the God of Heaven, because what I'm trying to show is that God has always been the God of all nations. He doesn't favor some over others. And I think he's raising up these testimonies today as one more line of evidence for anyone who really wants, we say we want a sign. Well, do you really? Because here they are, right?
So in your research and looking back at what you've done, are there always been the same amount of near-death experiences? Are there more happening? I mean, I think, everybody's asking if these are the end times now. I would kind of laugh and go, well, I can't imagine thinking it wasn't end times during World War II if you were in a Holocaust camp.
I know. I thought that too.
Yeah. But is it the same, or are they increasing? I know it's hard to know if not everybody's reporting, but.
Well, I know without a doubt the reporting of them is increasing. And I think it is because of modern medicine. I think it's because of modern medical resuscitation, but also, our ability to be on the scene when someone dies, to sustain their physical body long enough, I guess. But at the same time, there is a miraculous component to it. I mean, how do you explain, Dr. Mary Neal is a spine surgeon whose kayak gets pinned under a waterfall for 30 minutes.
Yeah.
How do you explain that? I mean, resuscitation, she said to me, yeah, resuscitation didn't bring me back. That's not what did it.
Exactly.
I mean, the people were doing resuscitation, but yeah. So I do think there are more and more. And the reason I am doing this and what I feel called to do is to point out how all of the evidence aligns, because I do think God is raising up testimony of himself all over the world. And now that, people in India can hear not just Santosh's story, I've got multiple Hindu people who experience the same God. I mean, the chief anesthesiologist of the Bakersfield Heart Hospital, okay, Hindu man, grew up in India. He becomes an anesthesiologist, name's Dr. Rajiv Parti. First of all, he didn't believe near-death experiences. He had presided over the anesthesia of people who had come back claiming to have a near-death experience, and he'd give them a shot of antipsychotic drug.
Oh yeah, that's
He
right.
thought it was bogus until he had his own. And he experiences this same God of light and love who gives him a life review and sends him back. And he also experienced hell and heaven, which again is a commonality. And I think there's a reason for that. But he comes back and he said that at another point, he has an encounter with this God of light. And he had been praying and trying to understand, who is this God? Because not like any of the gods I've known. And he asks, so this brilliant God of light is there before him, and he says, Lord, who are you? And he tells me, out of the light steps a man in a robe with a beard who says to him, I'm Jesus, your savior.
Wow.
I mean, he's a Hindu anesthesiologist who leaves his practice in anesthesiology and says he follows Jesus, and he's trying to heal wounds of the soul now.
Wow.
And,
So he
and
left. He left medicine.
he left medicine. Now, I will also say, like many Christians may look at what he's doing and going, "Oh, that's not good. That's not," and they're confusing things. They're mysterious things to me as well. But I ask him, do you believe in Jesus? Do you follow Jesus? And he's like, oh yeah, absolutely. And so I don't know, God is doing something, Now, let me, I'm sorry to keep going, but I want to point something
Not
out,
at all.
because there are two other Hindus that I write about in Imagine the God of Heaven, and they interpret their experience differently. So this one, Nia, was in Africa, and she's on a safari, and the lion tamer gets her to come into the cage, and the lioness attacks Nia and bites her multiple times on the head. And she said she left her body, and she said this brilliant glow, warmth, light like the dawn that was love took me to this place of exquisite beauty. And she said, there is a God, no doubt. And then she comes back and she says, I encountered the goddess Durga Ma. And that's who she worshiped, Durga Ma.
Okay.
So she interpreted this God of light and love that she experienced as Durga Ma. But Durga Ma is conventionally a woman with 4 arms riding a lioness with weapons in each hand. So she described the same God of the Bible who revealed himself to the people of Israel as this brilliant God of light, same God who, Jesus transfigured on the mountain, and his face was shining like the sun and his clothes brighter than white, as whitest white. And he said, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but have the light of life. Right. And so she's not describing the God she's claiming that she saw. She's describing the God who revealed himself through the Jewish prophets and through Jesus. Same thing with another one, Arvind, who died in a hospital. He floats out into the hallway of the hospital, and there it's like he said, it was like the dimensions opened up, and he sees this brilliant light, and he experiences this incredible peace and love, and then he's brought back. And he said that was the goddess Kali. Well, Kali is this woman who is dark blue or black with a long tongue hanging out, and anywhere from 8 to 12 arms with, again, weapons and all of it. That's not who he described.
Huh.
He described the same God of light and love that Jesus claimed to reveal. So that's what I'm trying to show. People can interpret what they experience in their own worldview. They will.
Right.
So,
And-
so have you
they
had?
don't know any better, or they don't
Right.
know.
So
Well, I think that's an important point. And that's a lot of why I was writing Imagine the God of Heaven. Because if someone has a very shallow, what I would call a very shallow experience. So in Imagine Heaven, I chronicle about 40 different commonalities that people report, that overlap, that they report. Like I said, things like colors beyond the color spectrum, or
Right.
Telepathic communication, or light that comes out of everything. This God of light and love. So all these, I totally lost my train of thought. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Where was I going?
Oh,
no, well, the commonalities about how
Yes.
you can interpret it differently, and some people have shallower experiences. And
Yeah,
so-
shallow experience. So if somebody dies, they leave their body, they are able to see with this new sight, they have new senses, they feel peace, they feel wonderful. Because what we discover is that this life, like you said, is the shadow. That one's the real thing. So they feel more on the other side, and we feel more on the other side no matter what our eternal destination is. And that's important. But imagine then that they just have a few of these experiences and boom, they come back to their body. Well, you can interpret that in a million different ways. And, I like to point that out because that often happens.
yeah.
But what I was trying to do is take all these data points across thousands that are common, and then say, okay, what do they say together, as commonly reported? And then isn't it fascinating how much it aligns? Like 38 of the 40 commonalities are found in the Bible. And I looked at the other scriptures as well, the Vedas, or the Tibetan Book of the Dead, or the Quran, and charted it out. And each has about, anywhere from 4 to 6 of those commonalities. But in the Bible, you find 38 out of the 40. And I could make a case for 40 out of 40, but some might say, you're stretching it on the 2.
So you haven't had a case where people cross over and there's this fat gold guy, it's Buddha, and he's like, oh yeah, by the way,
I'm Buddha.
I'm Buddha. Welcome to Nirvana. And
Do they come right out and say that? Yeah.
like, has anything? Have you
Well,
had?
no. I mean, if and that's what some people say. Well, you're just trying to prove your religion. It's like, no, actually, and I had to think hard about this, but I thought, if all these people were saying that they encountered Allah, right? Then I might need to reconsider. Okay, well, who is Allah, and why are they all saying that?
Right.
But they're saying Jesus. By the way, Nia, that the girl who was in Africa who said she saw the goddess Kalika, who was this brilliant light, also said she came back with a knowledge of Jesus and Christianity, which she didn't have before.
Wow.
Why? Right? Why?
Right.
And why would people all around the world, report this consistency? So I do think I do think you have to take into all the data points. And I say to people, don't go just watching one-off near-death experiences and then shape your worldview on what one person says. Because, hey, I've even interviewed Christians who interpret differently some of the things they're saying, and they can't both be right. And so that's where, what, for other reasons, I believe that we ought to look at what God has revealed in history through the Jewish prophets and ultimately through Jesus to interpret near-death experiences, not using near-death experiences to come up with who's God and what's going to happen after. And a big reason for that is because about 30% of near-death experiences say they came to a border or a boundary in their experience they knew they couldn't cross over and still come back. And so I believe that these experiences are something in between earthly life and eternal life or eternal death. So I liken them to, I can go and visit Buckingham Palace and see the place, but that doesn't mean the royal family has invited me to be adopted and move in forever.
Right.
So I think near-death experiences are like that. They're testimonies of the reality of the breadth of the life to come, and that this God of all nations who loves each person like they're his only child, that this is real and true. And what he did, more importantly, through Jesus, was to pay for every person's wrong, so that all it takes of anyone anywhere is a heart that wants God and turns to God in forgiveness and wants relationship, and they've got it.
Yeah, the thing that really hit me when we talked to Eben Alexander, and it has been, exploded 10 times speaking to you, is I think so often we just put God in such a box that our God, even though we may go to church and Bible study and all this stuff multiple times a week, we make God too small. And really, when you start to explore these experiences, especially explore them using the light of Scripture, you realize, God is way, way bigger and way more loving and way less judgy. Like some of these stories you tell about how people, they end up judging themselves, yet Jesus is standing there not judging them. Like that,
loving them unconditionally. And that's confused Christians, quite honestly. Because you're talking about the life review, and in this life review, in the presence of God, and sometimes he's appearing there in the form of Jesus, and they re-experience their lives. And what they commonly come back saying consistently is, one, God is love. And two, what God cares most about is how we love or treat one another, because that's what he showed them in their life review. They experienced not only what they were thinking and feeling as they interacted with each person, they experienced what the other person felt and was thinking and feeling from their act of kindness or their mean actions. And in some case, they saw how it rippled through humanity 10 times, 20 times, 30 times. How one life affects another, and how really we're connected in all this. And that's exactly what Jesus said in Matthew 25. He said, then one day the righteous will stand before the King of the universe, and he'll say to them, I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was hungry and you fed me. I was sick and you ministered to me. I was in prison and you visited me. And they'll say, when did we do these things for you, Lord? And he'll say, when you did it for the least of these brothers or sisters of mine, you did it to me. And you know what's fascinating, guys? I mean, I've had near-death experiencers like Howard Storm, who said, as he's watching his life and he's watching these acts of kindness, which he said, I didn't have that many, but this one time is very simple stuff sometimes. he was younger, and his sister, who he normally fought with, she loses her pet. And he hears her crying in the middle of the night, and he gets up from his bed and he goes in and he just puts his arm around her and comforts her. And Jesus is holding him, loving him, showing him these things. And he said, I could feel Jesus' joy over me showing this act of kindness.
Wow.
But he also said he saw scenes like, and he was an atheist, tenured college professor, when he had this experience. And it's fascinating because he gets rescued out of a hellish experience. But he said, this kid walks into his class that was one of his students, and he starts pouring out his heart about, this love of his life who had broken his heart. And Howard's rewatching this, and he's seen his thoughts and his motives right there before Jesus and the angels. They're all exposed. And he's sitting there thinking, I don't have time for that. They don't pay me enough for this. Would this snot-nosed kid just get out of my office? I got to get back to work. And he said, I felt the pain I caused the Lord, who he said, now I realize is my God, my creator, my savior, my best friend, and the most loving being I've ever experienced. And I don't want to hurt him. And yet it was like, metaphorically, like I was stabbing him in the heart when I was doing these just mean-hearted things.
Man, I
Yeah,
don't really want to have.
I've never-
I don't want to
I've-
have a life review. Please.
I've never felt that when I've seen a patient. Never.
Well, it is incredibly convicting. But let me say this too, because yeah, exactly. A lot of us, all of us say, I don't want to have a life review. But there's another side to it, because for instance, Randy, who's a CEO that I interviewed, in his life review, he's seen these things, and Jesus again is showing him these things, but he's asking, why are you showing me these? And in some cases, they were very painful memories. And in those cases, Jesus was showing him, I was always there with you, even through all of that, just waiting for you to turn to me. And he became an agnostic and an atheist and tried to disprove all religions and all this. He was a Northwestern student who was very antagonistic toward religion. But then he also showed him that all of those things had been paid for by Jesus. In other words, he showed them all of his wrongs, but in the light of God's grace and forgiveness. And what I like to remind people is it says in, Paul says in, I think it's 1 Corinthians 5, don't judge anything. It's an important thing. Don't judge anything. Wait until God comes, and then he will reveal what's in the heart and the motives and reward each person according to their deeds. Now, that's a part we often miss, that God is a rewarder. And this is the thing, when people say, well, why are you saying your religion is the only religion? No, that's not it at all. It's that God is the God of all people, and what he has done through Jesus has made a way that all people can be right with him, even though we've all done wrong. And not only that, but then he wants to reward us for every good act of kindness, every little deed, every time we've used our gifts to serve God, to serve humanity and love humanity. It all matters. And, that's what will change your life. That's what has changed these near-death experiencers' lives, is seeing this life review. They come back and they realize, working to prove myself to the world, trying to gain power and status and more material things, it doesn't matter at all. But every little act of kindness actually does. And it carries with it a reward. We are becoming who we will be when we step into the next life. It doesn't just change automatically. We are developing a capacity. Interestingly, a theologian, Jonathan Edwards, said this, but near-death experiencers confirm it, that in heaven we will all be overflowing with the love and joy and peace and kindness and goodness of God, but some with different capacities, some with just a thimble worth of capacity of overflowing, and some with a whole barrel's worth, right?
Wow.
So how we live really does matter.
So really, I think what we're trying to say after my mocking of live your best life is really what we should be doing is living our next best life.
Yeah,
Because that's, because, you can pay it forward all the way to eternity.
that's exactly right. And I like to say, and I write about that in Imagine Heaven, that I think one of the problems I see with many Christians, quite honestly, is that we live for retirement because we can picture it, right? But they haven't taken enough time to really picture what God has in store for those who love him. And so they don't live for the life to come, because it does change the way you live. It changes the way you love. It changes the way you're patient. It changes the way you go through suffering and can see that God is doing something in me. Those passages always confuse me, quite honestly. Like, where Paul would say things like, "And so we rejoice in our sufferings."
Yes.
It's like, no, we don't. And I don't.
Right.
Not
Right?
when you're in it. Not when you're in it.
Not when you're in it. But what he was saying is what near-death experiencers who have suffered greatly. I report in both books, a lot of people have suffered greatly in this life. And yet when they see it from the other side, they see that even though suffering it's not God's will. It's not like he's doing it to us. We exist in a world that lives apart from God's will and ways. That's why Jesus taught us to pray, "Your will be done on earth as it is in heaven," because it's not done on earth as it is in heaven. That only happens as we are individually willing, right? And so bad things do happen to good people. Suffering does happen to all people, but God can use it as we seek him for our good, not only in who it forms us to be in our spirit and our character, but also who we are becoming for eternity.
Well, and it's fascinating because living that way makes this life way better.
It does.
I mean, you're living your best life here when you actually are trying to send it ahead. I mean,
That's
I
exactly right.
I wrote about, or we did an episode about how I've just had this epiphany in the last several months of how I want to look for positive stuff. I'm sick of being negative and being a jerk, and it's amazing. Like, you change your attitude. It's like once a day I want to compliment somebody that's a stranger, and all of a sudden you're looking for all these opportunities, and all
Well,
of a
you
sudden
guys, you guys
you're
know
less
about
obnoxious.
the reticular activating system,
Yes.
Yes, exactly right.
right? It's that part in the lower part of our brain that, when you're interested in a blue Toyota, suddenly everywhere you look, you see blue Toyotas. Well, that's your reticular activating system. It tells you what matters to you and what to pay attention to.
It's called the blue Corvette in our house.
Yeah. Well.
It's
Yeah.
fun and
So
funny.
and neuroplasticity,
Yes.
right?
Exactly.
Our that the way we continue to form our neural networks actually affects then how we move forward. So, and I think that again, in Philippians chapter 4, Paul says, "Fix your mind on the things that are good and noble and trustworthy," and basically, think about and meditate on the good things of God and the gifts that he's given you, and the peace of God will be with you.
Right.
It
Yeah,
does.
it's so weird. Even though the church was being persecuted by the Romans and all of this stuff, that there was never a verse that says freak out about the next election.
Oh boy, let me tell you. Well, so interestingly, the church that I've led for 26 years that I just passed the baton to is about half Democrat and half Republican, because we reach the culture. So it's not one or the other. It's just the culture coming to faith and then trying to work it all out. And let me tell you, man, whew,
Oh,
Election seasons have been like, but I honestly, I've been so encouraged by so many of these new believers who do start to realize, like, because I would do messages on it. Like, you got to pick which kingdom comes first, right? Because remember Pilate's conversation with Jesus. He said, "Do you know who I am? I could kill you." And Jesus said, "You could do nothing if my Father hadn't given you the ability to do what you're doing."
right.
And and he says, "So you think you're a king then?" And he said, "My kingdom is of another world. Otherwise, I would fight, my angels would fight, and you wouldn't have a chance." And so, yeah, I think, it's very important to, I think in these kinds of times, to realize that, we've got to look to God's kingdom first, and not hook our wagon first to one or other kingdom party to be our savior, because that's not the savior, period.
Right.
No, I mean, I
That's
couldn't say that
perfectly
better.
said.
I hate this. I hate this savior complex stuff. Like the Superman. It's like, no. If you want to change your community, you change your community by being nice to your neighbors, by having them over, by playing cards with them, by, getting involved in your local school board. All of those things. That's it. This idea that we're gonna give money, we're gonna get all freaked out, we're gonna carry signs, and then some Superman's gonna swoop in. That is, ooh, boy, you get what you pay for when you do that, and it usually ends very poorly. So I'm really glad you said that.
Yeah.
We are unfortunately getting low on time. There's one more thing that you have to answer,
All right.
which is, do dogs go to heaven?
Yeah. What's funny is that seems to be people's number one question.
Oh my gosh, of course.
Dogs or cats? I don't know about cats.
Yes.
That's what you would say.
Oh,
I'm
I loved our cats.
I love cats. Yeah, no, all of them. So this is very fascinating because I'll give you a couple of actual examples. So I interviewed a woman from Colombia. Her name is Karina Martinez. She actually died during COVID. So it's fascinating because she grew up Catholic, but she had a really rough, her parents abandoned her and, left her here in the States as a teenager, speaking Spanish, no English, just went through, you can imagine all that she went through. She dies during COVID, is up above her body, sees her husband down below. "Oh my gosh, am I dead?" And she said, "Suddenly I realized, oh my gosh, God is real. The afterlife is real." And she realized all the wrongs she had done. And she starts saying the Our Father, that she had learned, growing up as a Catholic. And when she got to forgive me, she's just like, I was sincere, like, "Lord, forgive me. But she's going down. And just like my friend Paul, she knows she's headed to a hellish place. And it's, they say darker than black. You can't even describe it. And hopeless. That's the common thing they say. There's no hope. But a hand grabs her and turns her around, and she starts going up toward this light. And in the light, she sees, like, almost like silhouettes, all these people, and they're all saying, "Karina, come." They were all celebrating her. And she's just like, "Me? Why are they celebrating me?" And she hears the voice of the Lord say, "Come, you're home." And she says, "No, I can't. I'm a horrible person. I don't belong there. Send me back to hell. I know that's where I was going." And again, this comes back to, you said about we judge ourselves.
Mhm.
We can pretend and justify on this side. You can't on the other side. It's just clear. It's clear. And that's true of people. Jesus, by the way, said, "By your own words will you be acquitted, by your own words will you be condemned." He said that. And so this happens. But she had asked for his forgiveness, and that's all it took. Just a heart turning back to God. And he's saying to her, "Come, you're home." And she's not willing. And they kept saying, come, come. And finally she said, Lord, if it really is okay, then show me one of my family members who's died before me, and I'll know it's safe. I'll know it's okay. And he said, look to your right. And she looks to her right, and there is her little dog who died the week before she died.
That's right.
And another little dog who had died several years earlier. And in she goes to this just paradise, just beauty. Randy, the CEO I interviewed, even more powerful story. He grew up a very troubled childhood because he had horrible asthma. He was in and out of the hospital all the time. He was overweight, so incredibly bullied. He only had one friend, and in the place they lived, that friend got beaten so badly by a gang at the bus stop, the family moved away. So he lost his only friend. And all he had was Casey, it was like a little kind of toy poodle kind of dog. So he's there in heaven with Jesus, and Jesus is giving him what he called these vignettes of his life, like a life review, but in these vignettes. And he's showing him being bullied. He's showing him in the hospital, suffering. And this is where Randy asked Jesus, why are you showing me this? This is very painful. I tried to forget this. And that's when he looks at Jesus, and suddenly in his face, he realizes, and he says, were you there with me? And he said, beloved, I was always there with you, just waiting for you to turn to me. And then he shows him, they're walking through paradise, just this beautiful path and flowers and gorgeous mountains in the distance. And off in the distance, he sees, and this is really wild, but it was like these linens, he said, that flowed down off the foothills of this mountain into this valley of flowers. But it was all these linens rippling, kind of like bouncing up and down, and children laughing and shouting and giggling and screaming on these. Almost, he didn't say this, but it's all like heaven's bounce house. Isn't that incredible?
Wow.
And Randy looks at Jesus and he says, what is this? Why are you showing me this? And Jesus said, these are the children whose time ended before it was their time. I'm restoring their joy. And then Randy realized that what God was saying is, and I'm restoring your joy that was lost in childhood as well. And they're there before this river, and Randy has this desire, and he looks at it, and he reaches down and he drinks of the water of this river, which I think is the river of life, that's talked about in Revelation. And he said it was like this joy, like ecstasy, just erupting out of every cell of my being. And he's just like out of his mind, and he turns to Jesus, and Jesus is holding a flask, and he says, well, like a bottle. And he says, what is that, Lord? And he says, I've been collecting your tears, beloved. And that's a scripture where David says, you collect all my tears in your bottle. And he turns the bottle and empties it into this river. And Randy just knew he's going to take all of my sorrows and he's going to return them for joy. And that's what the Lord was showing him. And it's just unbelievable. What I find so fascinating, you guys, is with so many of these near-death experiencers, like Santosh with the narrow gate, like Swadik, where I died for mankind, like Randy, where the flask and the returning it for joy. All this is in the Bible, but so many times he gives parables to near-death experiencers.
Huh.
And it confused me for a long time until I realized, that is Jesus. That's exactly what Jesus did. He taught everything in parables. Why? Well, because For those whose heart really was seeking, they would find. And for those who really were just demanding of God, they would just get frustrated and walk away.
Yeah.
Wow, I never thought of it that way.
Interesting.
Well, this, I mean,
I was going to say, we could go on forever, but how many of these near-death experiences happen with people that are Christians, practicing faith, believers? Like, I'm getting a sense that most of these are people that were atheists or agnostics or of different religions, but it's all faiths, right? I mean,
It's
there's
all.
Christians that, okay.
It's all. And you know what? I forgot what got me to Randy is one of the things that happened during that is across the field comes running Casey, his little dog, who jumps up and licks his face just like he used to. This is in heaven. Casey had died, when he was in college. And here's this little puppy. And Jesus says to him, "See, beloved, I give you the desires of your heart."
well, you have just gutted me like a fish with that one.
But it's what I want people to see is that he's so much better than we can possibly imagine. And if you don't trust him fully, and if God is not yet the desire of your heart and the greatest love, you realize that, yeah, every love I've ever had, every desire I've ever had is contained within him.
Yeah, exactly.
Then you don't fully know him. And that's what I'm trying to show in Imagine the God of Heaven.
Wow.
That's awesome.
Well, I hope we, and I can speak. I hope we can have you back because we could speak for hours. I hope to meet you someday in person. It's always been a delight when we've, made these quick friendships and podcasting. When we actually get to meet people in person, it's been just a delight.
Well, you could have just met him when we were
because we were just in Austin. Our daughter just graduated from UT. So
Good morning. That's where I went to engineering college.
Yeah. So that was an amazing experience. So thank you so much, John. We really, really appreciated this. I know that this is going to be as moving to our listeners as it is to us. And I will be processing this one for quite a while.
All right. And then
thanks for having me.
We'll put links. They can find you at your website, which is imagineheaven.net, correct?
Yeah.
Yep. And then you're on Facebook. Where else?
I think John Burke Official. John Burke Official is the handle or what to search for.
Okay.
And Imagine Heaven book on Instagram and at John Burke Official should get you everywhere we need to go.
Yeah.
So again, thanks again. We'll put all that into the show notes. And if you're willing, we would love to have you back because this has just been in such tough times. This is so delightful to know there's a reality beyond this nonsense.
Well, just invite me. I'll come back. I'd love to. It's been fun talking with you guys.
You bet. Thank you so much.
Thanks.